Welcome back. So today we're going to take a look at KBEAR's new ink. So ink is their new 8.8 millimeter diameter DLC dynamic driver. The set itself is one dynamic driver, very much like Diamond in the past. And this is, I guess, the spiritual successor to Diamond. So we will talk a little bit about that in a bit. But here it is up close. It has a very, if you actually had a KBEAR Diamond or had a KBEAR Believe, you'll pretty much recognize the same exact shell. This one is the black version with the brass nozzle, same recessed 2-pin, and a new, graphic underneath the kind of resin. So still quite attractive, pretty much like Diamond and Believe. Always a comfortable and attractive shell. Cable itself, not as much. It is a black, and I forgot what the material was, but I wasn't really a fan of the ear hooks. They're a little too tight for me, and it tend to pull the shells out of my ears. Even though I was using these are actually the KB07 ear tip sets, which are actually quite nice, and I use them on a lot of sets. They give you the full set here in a little bag. And additionally, you get other silicone tips and the attractive leather case that will be familiar if you've had other KBEAR models in the past as well. So I do want to thank KEEPHiFi for sending this one to me. If you look on their website, it is $69. And one thing I did notice on their website when I went to print this out, so free shipping at 1 cent. And I don't know if that's brand new or what the deal is, but I'm almost positive that I've paid shipping on some cheaper sets before, so maybe that's a new thing. I'll have to ask about that, but do take notice if you're in the market for something. So let's kind of jump into it, and I will say that the ink is, very much, if you had any other KBEAR sets, you sort of know that they tend to be bassy sets. And ink is really no different. It is, borderline Basshead set. It's got a ton of bass. So I will call it KBEAR Fun, very much in line with Diamond, and even Aurora was actually a bassy set, just not as V-shaped as ink. So KBEAR Fun, it is very engaging, very musical, a very bass-heavy V-shape with a kind of a thick on the bottom and a slightly thin upper, and or an upper, forward, lower treble. So let's take a quick look at what this actually looks like on the graph, and I will sort of explain what I mean by thick and thin. So if we look at the trio, Aurora, Diamond, and Ink, Ink is in the blue. So Ink and Diamond pretty much have the same elevated bass, and it's a lot of bass. That's sort of no joke, bass head kind of right there. It's a lot of bass. And it actually carries quite a bit into the mids, and it kind of bottoms out, and then you get this really steep rise into the pinna gain area, and quite elevated pinna gain, and these two sort of make up the KBEAR V-shape that I'll talk about in a bit, but yeah, quite elevated here, even above Diamond levels, and then it actually kind of trails off, and it actually sounds a little more relaxed than it looks like on the graph, but that is the gist of this really kind of elevated bass, thick bottom, and this is dragged up, a bit too high, so it'll come across as a bit too thin, especially if you don't have tracks that tend to dwell in this area. If you're just listening to, sort of mids with this lower treble, that's going to hit you maybe a little bit thin. So we'll talk a little bit about that as well. So one track to take notice of, so Alice in Wonderland, Safe Life. It actually goes through sort of both areas of the thick and the thin on this set. And I point to, I think, another song by her too. So her new album tends to have a lot of bass and then a lot of, electronic 2 to 5K-ish sounds, sort of electronic sounds. And I think, for V-shapes, those tend to work out okay as long as you're not boosted too much on a 2 to 5K. And I tended to think that track actually hits both sides of it, and in general on this set, I think it is a V-shape, but you do have to pay attention to tracks like that, which are going to hit those areas kind of hard because you will take notice of it. So as I said, on the V scale, Aurora, Diamond, and Ink. Aurora was actually the kind of the shallowest V. It was actually this mild V shape, and it was actually quite thick. It's a bit slower, very much like a BLON BL03 in this level, not nearly as elevated as ink and diamond. So on the V scale of, how big are this one and this one, I will say that, Aurora was at the bottom, and then you have diamond kind of right in the middle, which had about the same base, but didn't quite elevate as much in the lower treble. And so ink will sort of take the crown on the big V scale between Aurora, diamond, and ink. On the BLON scale, we could take a look at this, and I'll sort of point out. So same, kind of very similar. When you look at ink in the blue versus BL01 versus BL03, so not too far on the base side. So again, all three of those are actually quite basey sets. All of them carry quite a bit of energy straight into the mids. But when you look at the pin and gain area and this lower treble area, where BL03, maybe you think it's a little dark, maybe you think it's right on, maybe you just think it's not fatiguing and very nice. That level works for quite a bit, quite many people. BL01 stretched it just a little bit to give it maybe a little more detail, a little bit more crispness and sharpness. You elevate it for the people who thought this was a little bit dark. So again, that's kind of a nice level as well. And then you'll see that ink sort of took that to the next level and raised that area up quite a bit. So do think about that quite a bit when you're really considering ink as your next purchase. And I will say, because of that same area, ink is very much better at medium volume listeners with that pin and gain and the bass as well, because it's actually quite a bit of bass, and you will get a little bass fatigued if you're not used to that much bass. And as I said, the cable can tug on the shell a little bit. You'll lose a little bass, and it'll become quite sharp if you're not too careful and don't pay attention to that cable tugging on the shell. Source-wise, I do like neutral on this one, so not really any extra bass or any treble. It's got a ton of bass, so you don't really need a big warm source for it. And at the same time, you don't really need a high-end treble source, a brighter source, as that's just going to emphasize an already high level of lower treble. So bass, like I said, lots of bass and boosted really to balance the lower treble. And you can sort of see what they're really meant to do here. And lots of bass here, but if you don't have enough lower treble here, it'll sound too muddy. So lots of bass, lots of lower treble, and what happens in the middle, it gets a little recessed. But between those two, they tend to balance out each other. And I would highly suggest that consider your library and do pick. Your library really needs to have bassy tracks. If you're just kind of mid-centric or just maybe upper end type of tracks and genres, probably not a candidate for ink. It really needs to have something that appeals to V shapes and has a bit of both to really balance itself out. So like I said, for those who really like a lot of bass, it's got this meaty, heavy, and it slams quite good on a track like Judith by A Perfect Circle. That's kind of a track, even though that's not an R&B or a rap or a typically bass-heavy track. That one really hits down pretty low, and the drums, and it just hits the right spot for that kind of genre, even on a set that I would call a bass head set. But you do lose a little bit of detail and clarity because that bass is kind of way elevated. So if you're a bass detail texture fan, if you're like a tight and fast bass fan, this one's probably not for you. This is guys who like a really lots of bass. So not too much really wrong with it. It's just really for bass head guys who like a lot of bass. It is still controlled. It's not like kind of loose and flabby and going all over the place. There's lots of control to it. Very nice high bass level set. But the level is high, and you do have to really understand how that's going to affect your mids. So as we go into the mids, like I said, it's got this thick to thin, edgy to crisp, and just the way the bass carries into the mids, you know that the bottom of that was going to be quite a bit thicker, meatier, and that's not really going to be any surprise. But how it rises into this really steep pin and gain area, and for me, to my ears, this always tends to give female vocals and instruments in this area just a little bit of thinness to them. So you can interpret that as a little more detail, but it tends to drag them just a little bit thin. And I think that's actually what happens here. And that's why I do suggest listening to have a library that really hits here and here at the same time, because that's where it sounds best. If you're just hearing one side of those, it's not nearly as going to be as pleasurable. So like I said, it's quite a layer of sharp upper, lower treble over that warmer lower mid section as it carries in lots of bass energy. Slight V-shaped, recessed on the mids. Your vocals are going to be set back a little bit because of this sharp V. And you're going to notice that the level of detail isn't quite as high as other sets, even at that price point. As I said, this one is really targeted towards bass guys and not so much mid-centric, high detail, vocal people. Like I said, you really got to have a library that fits this one pretty well. So Alice in Wonderland again, the first track on that CD is called Forever. At about 49 seconds, her voice should be, it goes all quiet. You just hear her vocals, and it should sound really ethereal, lots of reverb. And this one's, it's actually really close, considering how much bass there is. Kind of gets there. It's kind of close. What it is, it's a bit sharp and edgy. Maybe it's a little bit too fast. I do wish it was just a little bit more fuller, like you get on some other sets, but not too bad considering what's going on with the signature. And then as that song continues, lots of lower treble energy is really going to test you, your tolerance for that 2 to 5K. And like I said, you got to really be aware of that area and how that fits in with your library, because it will test you on your ears, and then also test you on your volume preferences, whether you are a lower volume listener or a higher volume listener. That area will be a little more challenging to listen to. And then tracks, sort of ones that are usually really in your face, really intimate, really close. Ocean Eyes by Billie Eilish, another one, Bites of Dust by Queen. They do just sit back a little bit more than, I guess not, I was expecting. I guess I was expecting it because I could see the graph and you can see that it was a big V shape and the mids were going to be a little bit more recessed. So not too surprising, but I do think it sort of lives up to the having mids that are slightly recessed. And I think on those two tracks where you expect them to be super close and super intimate, super detailed, they do fall back just slightly a bit. So the treble, like I said, it's got this big upper or this big lower treble, upper mid, that lower area, that pinna gain area. Tons of energy right there, and it comes through on female vocals, but it continues through to 5K. So like I said, you got to really watch those electronic popular songs, Alice in Wonderland, all those electronic things that happen in 2 to 5K. Guitars happen, snares happen, all those things will tend to pop out a little bit because there's so much energy. So not necessarily peaking or fatiguing as long as you have the bass, and that's why I keep on saying you got to really think about a library that hits both of those sides, because if you're just hitting 2 to 5K, it's going to be a little bit too much energy to hear on its own. So that level is a bit too high, and it will be a volume limiter for you. So the rest is very much easier going. After you pass 5K, it starts to drop off a little bit, and the way it sounds doesn't necessarily the way it graphs. This part, maybe it's just because of where they have the peaks and the troughs, the way it actually sounds. It's definitely a little more easygoing in the upper treble area. Nice extension, but the extension in the air just kind of just okay. The upper treble will definitely wake up with more volume, but on a track like deadmau5's Strobe, you just have this competition with the bass. And again, this isn't something that should be surprising when you look at the signature. And if you've listened to sets like this before, it's very hard to have really high quality treble extension and detail when you have that much bass kind of competing with it. And I think it does affect the timbre just a little bit on a track like deadmau5's Strobe. It just struggles a little bit to kind of soar where it really should. But a track, something with a little lower end, so Strobe is kind of high up in the treble, something a little lower, closer to that 2 to 5K area. Molly Cruz, Kickstart My Heart, Looks That Kill, that kind of stuff with the guitars, drums, vocals. Actually, that sounds quite good. That's kind of in a sweet spot as opposed to the upper treble, which is a little more struggling on the Ink, but not too bad. It's kind of just okay. And then Stage, again, is one of these things where at this price point, it probably should be a little wider, a little bigger than it is. And if that's a priority for you, you really have to really think about that. It's noticeable to me that it feels a little more closed in than it really should, especially at that price point. And it definitely has some depth and it has some height, but generally it just should have been a little bit bigger, and that would have given you a little more separation. And with all that bass, you just needed all the clarity. You needed the stage to really help the mids just a little bit. And this one doesn't really go big enough to really give you any kind of added bonus to the mid. So the didn't really work right there. So I do think they should have really thought about that and how that worked in the mids. But then you would say, well, maybe it's just a bass headset, and they weren't so concerned about that. They were really concentrated on getting the bass right and a treble level that wasn't overkill. And they probably did that. So I will nitpick it and say the stage should be bigger, but that was probably not in their design blueprint for what they were trying to accomplish with Ink. So again, thank you guys for tuning in, and that's all I got on Ink. So take care, and I will see you next time.